Hello, this is Joan Fernley, your French and Latin diction coach for choirs. And in this video, I will read Les Djinns by Gabriel Fauré with poetry by Victor Hugo. I will begin with some context and what makes this poem so innovative, and that will be followed by a bit of commentary on Fauré's version. And this means that I'm going to cover a bit of diction before the reading, and I highly recommend that you watch that before listening to the reading. Now, I won't do a line-by-line coaching as this is a fairly long poem, but the tips after the reading are quite extensive, so I hope we'll cover enough ground for you. Now, the timestamps are up on the screen, so if you need to jump around the video, you can just find the minutes as I've put them up on the screen. The score for this piece is available in the public domain, but it's 21 pages long. So that's a lot of paper, but mostly that's a lot of page turns. So I created a vocal score for my own choir, which you can download using the link in the description box. Now, there is a disclaimer to my score versus the original score. I was not able to create that little grace note that you find in the original score. I just couldn't insert it without causing other issues. So I just omitted it, and you can pencil it back in if you like. Now, as a bonus, when I create a score, I can create part dominant practice tracks. And yes, the link to those practice tracks are in a playlist that's linked in the description box. So I hope you'll make use of these. Again, let me know if you find any mistakes. I'll do my best to correct them. And as always, if you like what I do, like, share, subscribe, and comment below. And now, let's dive in. Victor Hugo is probably the most famous and prolific 19th century French author. He was born in 1802 and died in 1885, and his literary career spanned his entire adult life. You don't need to be well versed in French literature to recognize his two most famous plays, Notre-Dame de Paris or The Hunchback of Notre Dame and Les Misérables. His poem Les Djinns is part of a larger collection of works titled Les Orientales, published in 1829. This was a fairly early work. He was 27 years old, but he was already an accomplished writer. Now, who are these Djinn? Well, these are mythical creatures originating from pre-Islamic Arabia and possibly beyond. In the Arabian tradition, they can be scary or mischievous, but they are not necessarily evil. They're in fact quite complex creatures, and if you want to learn more, you can check out the links in the description box. In this poem, the narrator recounts the frightening night when a swarm of jinn descended on his house, only to then disappear in the night. This poem doesn't tell a story. The point of the poem is to describe a scene. And as we'll see, it's how he crafted the poem that makes it so fun and innovative. The poem is made up of 15 verses, and each verse has 8 lines. If we line up all 15 verses and tip the poem on its side, the structure is impossible to miss. We have a perfectly symmetrical crescendo and decrescendo. Starting at opposite ends of the poem, we have verses with 2-syllable lines. Then working our way in, we add a syllable to the lines of the next verse. When we get to the middle verse, each line has 10 syllables. This structure perfectly matches the poem's text that describes the swarm of jinn and the narrator's emotional roller coaster. In addition, each verse follows the same rhyming structure, A, B, A, B, C, 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 B. For example, let's look at verse 4. The A rhyme is osh in the words approche and cloche. The B rhyme is di in the words redit, maudit, and grandit, and the C rhyme is oule in the words foule, roule, and s'écroule. Now, I'm no expert in 19th century poetry, but this rhyming structure seems a bit asymmetrical. You might expect the rhyme to alternate between A and B, or more often you might get something a bit more creative, but still symmetrical. You might have ABA followed by DCCD. So why do we have this cluster of 3 lines with the same rhyme? I honestly don't know, I can only guess, but my guess is that Victor Hugo is going for special effects. So that three-line cluster, in effect, does two things. At the beginning and at the end of the poem, in the crescendo and decrescendo sections, it's a kind of echo pattern, and it helps to build the anticipation. And for the middle verses, it creates a sense of urgency that highlights the terror and panic. And the final nugget in this poem came as a surprise to me. As a singer and conductor, I'm interested in sound, and I wondered if the vowel placement of the repeated C rhyme might also follow a pattern. So I did a little experiment. For example, in verse 1, the C rhyme is is in the words grise and brise, and the vowel sound that dominates the rhyme is the E sound. So I identified that vowel sound that dominates the C rhyme for all 15 verses, and I placed them on the vowel diagram. Interestingly, the C rhyme for the 5 middle, more intense verses of the poem are all made up of vowel sounds that are forward and closed or partially closed. You can think of these sounds as being pointy or edgy. This contrasts with the remaining vowels that are either open or voiced further back in the throat. The only exception to this pattern is the E vowel sound in verse 1, but that verse is sung very softly, and any vowel sung that softly won't have an edge. Now, I'm not suggesting that Victor Hugo had this diagram in mind. In fact, this diagram dates back to 1917, and it's attributed to Daniel Jones, who was only 4 years old when Victor Hugo died. But no doubt Victor Hugo had a good ear for sound, and whether it was intentional or subconscious, I think it's a fascinating observation. But it's also possible that I'm overthinking this, so I'm going to quit while I'm ahead and move on to Fauré's arrangement. Gabriel Fauré was the first composer to set this poem to music, and his version is the only choral version. It was published in 1875, just 10 years after his very famous Cantique de Jean Racine. And yes, I have a diction video for that piece, and it's linked below. Interestingly, Fauré chose to omit verses 6 and 7 in the crescendo section and verses 10 and 12 in the decrescendo section, but he nevertheless kept the poem's symmetry. In French art song, poetry comes first and music comes second to elevate the text. And composers like Fauré make it look easy and so singable, but it's not always so simple. They have to account for the fact that singing is not speech, and singing comes with its own set of challenges, especially when it comes to words ending with the letter E. And this leads me into some key tips you need to know before moving on to the reading. These are linked to final E's and the liaison, which means to link two words together as we speak them, particularly as this relates to Fauré's arrangement. You'll recall the poem's structure that begins with a verse made up of 2-syllable lines, then the next verse has 3 syllables, and so on. These are spoken syllables. Here's what I mean. This line from verse 2 is a great example. If you were to count the syllables for each word in isolation, you would get a total of 6 syllables. But when you string the words together in speech, you have 3 spoken syllables. Comme une âme. So the E's disappear. They're either swallowed up in the 2 liaisons or as a silent E at the end of the line. However, in French song, final E's are voiced, unless of course they're swallowed up by a liaison. So where Hugo gives us 3 spoken syllables, Fauré's hands are tied and he gives us 4 sung syllables. Sort of, because the final E's, even if they're sung and voiced, they are never emphasized and they should still feel like they belong to the previous syllable. And I want to flag the typesetting of this line in the original score. It looks like you should sing une, but that would be incorrect. The liaison between une and âme remains as une âme. If you're not convinced, in the soprano line, the dotted pattern is beamed. And in the alto line, if he had wanted une, he would have given us 2 eighth notes instead of a quarter note. And if you need even more convincing, check out how the words are written in this early score. there's no question, it's definitely comme une âme. To do or not to do a liaison is the eternal question that plagues French speakers, myself included. And when I do diction videos, I double check all my liaisons. There are some clear-cut rules, but many optional cases as well, and there are far more liaisons in formal speech and French art song than you'll find in casual speech. So needless to say, in the world of the liaison, I sometimes feel like the dinner guest who doesn't really know which fork to use. So I won't go into an explanation of these rules, and normally I wouldn't even bring this up. But Fauré has forced my hand. Consider the second line of the third verse. This line is read and sung as 4 syllables, semble grelot. However, if you look at the score, Fauré inserted a rest between semble and un. So it's fair to ask if you should in fact do the liaison. And the answer is yes. And why? Because that's one of the clear-cut cases. It's the rule, and Fauré always follows the rules. And if it's not convincing enough, have a look at this old score. The first word is split in 2, and the second syllable is very close to un. In other words, to do both the rest and the liaison, you have to cut the first word in half, semble, with the rest in between. This isn't the only spot where this kind of interruption happens, and it's worth considering why Fauré does this. I think he's doing this because he wants to convey tension and nervous anticipation. So these lines are not staccato. Rather, think of these lines as an interrupted legato phrase that's actually sung in one breath. So those rests are not for resting or breathing, they're moments of suspense. It's as if your heart stops. Now, Fauré takes this idea of an interrupted legato line one step further in the first and last verses. Fauré gives the ending E a small note, a kind of grace note, but it's on the same pitch. In these verses, he still wants us to voice the ending E, but only as little as possible. Again, the goal is to create an atmosphere of nervous anticipation, this ominous calm before the storm. The question then is how to voice those final E's. In speech, the final E is known as the schwa, and this is the generic sound in many languages that you get when all the articulators are relaxed. It's just that's it. For example, if I simply read these words from the first verse, I would say ville, asile, grise, brise. So the E is barely there. In fact, in the book that I refer to for all these videos, the schwa is called a silent E. It's not really silent, but you can think of the schwa as the extra space that allows us to fully voice and release the consonant that comes before. And it's often that consonant that allows us to make sense of a word. Unfortunately, the schwa isn't really singable, so singers need to modify it to a sound that's just a bit more focused with better resonance, but still not emphasized. And that's the vowel, as in the French word for egg, œuf. Now, you don't want to take it too far and too dark into It's simply as in œuf. So just practice the word œuf and you'll get the perfect Goldilocks vowel, not too open and not too closed. Now, French is full of words with these final E's, and this poem is no exception. If you recall the poem's rhyming pattern ABAB, CCCB, it just so happens that the final words in the A rhymes all end with a final E, and the same goes for the C rhymes, but never the B rhymes. That's a total of 75 final words with a final E in the original poem. And this schwa sound can also occur inside a word, but it's far less common. In Fauré's version, I only spotted 3 examples: demeure, battement, and sauterelle. I don't think I've ever spent this much time on a so-called silent vowel, but In this poem, it's inescapable. And interestingly, depending on the verse, Fauré gives the final E at the end of a line more or less space. In the softest first and last verses, he gives you those tiny notes. Then in the next verses, the final E's get an eighth note, and for the middle verses, the more dramatic verses, they get at least a quarter note. By the time we hit the middle climactic verse, Fauré brings out the final truly silent E to great effect in the three C rhymes. Each line ascends with an almost chromatic scale, and the final E's lead you right into the next line. To me, these sound like three howling gusts of wind, and it just so happens that this verse is all about the wind beating down on the house. So, with all that in mind, let's move on to the reading, but do stick around after the reading for a few more tips. For the reading, I will read the lyrics as if I were singing this piece and not just simply speaking the words. And of course, I will read the lyrics from Fauré's score and not the original poem. Mur, ville et port, asile de mort, mer grise où brise la brise, tout dort. Dans la plaine naît un bruit, c'est la laine de la nuit. Elle brame comme une âme qu'une flamme toujours suit. La voix plus haute semble un grelot d'un nain qui saute, c'est le galop. Il fuit s'élance, puis en cadence, sur un pied danse, au bout d'un flot. La rumeur approche, l'écho la redit. C'est comme la cloche d'un couvent maudit. Comme un bruit de foule qui tonne et qui roule, et tantôt s'écroule, et tantôt grandit. Dieu, la voix sépulcrale des djinns, quel bruit ils font! Fuyons sous la spirale de l'escalier profond. Déjà s'éteint ma lampe et l'ombre de la rampe qui le long du mur rampe monte jusqu'au plafond. Cri de l'enfer, voix qui hurle et qui pleure, l'horrible essaim poussé par l'aquilon. Sans doute au ciel s'abat sur ma demeure, le mur fléchit sous le noir bataillon. La maison crie et chancelle penchée, et l'on dirait que du sol arraché, ainsi qu'il chasse une feuille séchée, le vent la roule avec leur tourbillon. Prophète, si ta main me sauve de ces obscurs démons des soirs, j'irai prosterner mon front chauve devant tes sacrés encensoirs. Fais que sur ces portes fidèles meure leur souffle d'étincelles, et qu'en vain l'ongle de leurs ailes grince et crie sur ces vitraux noirs. De leurs ailes lointaines le battement décroît, si confus dans les plaines, si faible que l'on croit. Ouïr la sauterelle crier d'une voix grêle, ou pétiller la grêle sur le plomb d'un vieux toit. Les djinns funèbres, fils du trépas, dans les ténèbres, pressent leurs pas. Leur essaim gronde, ainsi profonde, murmure une onde qu'on ne voit pas. Ce bruit vague qui s'endort, c'est la vague sur le bord. C'est la plainte presque éteinte d'une sainte pour un mort. On doute la nuit, j'écoute, tout fuit, tout passe, l'espace, efface le bruit. For these tips, I've covered quite a few vowel sounds and I've grouped them under these three letters, the letter E, the letter O, and the letter U, which in French is pronounced U. So let's begin with letter E. I already spoke extensively about how singers must modify the schwa to as in œuf. But there are many true sounds in French, which in this song show up with the EU spelling. In our song, we have these four words: pleure, demeure, meurt, and leur. And we also have this word that most English singers find very challenging. The EU is still the sound. So we begin with the sound f, f. Then we add the ILL that comes next, and this is usually what trips people up. But that's simply a y sound. So this word is simply feuille, feuille, feuille. So it's not fouille, which is something I hear now and then, but rather it's feuille. The EU combination also has a dark side, a more closed version, e. You typically find this at the end of a word, and I only spotted two examples in this song, Dieu and vieux. Whatever you do, it is not an oo sound, and this is a very common mistake. I hear Dieu instead of Dieu. And this mistake happens because English doesn't have front rounded sounds like ö and u. Only back vowels are rounded in English, like o and oo. This is why most English singers default to the oo sound, but make sure you do an ö sound. Now, perhaps the most common sound in the E family is the S sound. It's not particularly difficult for English speakers, it's just as in bed. But now and then, depending on the word, watch out for the diphthong as in a, as in say. So there is no diphthong, it's simply eh. There are plenty of examples of this sound in this song. I won't sound them all out, just go back and listen to the reading, but I'll cover the categories that come up in the song that illustrate the basic rules. The S sound is easy to spot when you see these two accents. For example, funèbre and grêle. Another possibility is where the E comes before a final voiced consonant, such as enfer. Keep in mind that if you do see an R, make sure it's not a verb, and we'll get to that later. You also get the open S sound when the E is followed by a double consonant, as in sauterelle. This next list of words is a great example of the difference between sung French and spoken French. In singing, these little words get the S sound, such as de, but in speech, the S sound in some parts of the world has shifted to e. The last example of the S sound typically doesn't even involve the letter E, but rather a combination of A and I, and much less often you'll see a combination of E and I, as in fait and maison. The next sound in the E family is the A sound. The easiest words to spot with that sound are the ones with this accent, and of course not to be confused with the other two accents that we spoke about earlier. There are 19 words with this accent in Fauré's version, so I will just list a couple of examples here, as in the word sécher. And sometimes you'll see two different accents, as in ténèbres. There are also verbs that end in ER, which together are voiced as E, and the R is not voiced in this case. And the first verb on this list also has an accent at the beginning, and you get pétiller. Languages always have exceptions that you just need to know, and we have a few examples here. We get this word that ends in ER, and it's not a verb, but it's still pronounced with the ER combination, and it's pronounced escalier. And then we have et, which simply means and. And finally, we have the word pied. Now, moving on to the O group, there are three possible sounds that range from open and short to closed and long. We'll begin with the long closed O. So this O is not simply a closed O, it's long. You get a long O anytime you see the little hat accent. O as in au ciel and tantôt. Or when O is part of the final vowel with a silent consonant or no consonant at all, such as grelot. Next is the basic closed O, which in this song is not even spelled with an O, but rather the combination of AU, as in haute and maudit. And then we have the very common open O, and I won't go through all of them because there are many, but I will highlight three categories. You get an open O when the O is followed by a double consonant. So we have comme, tonne, and horrible. Next are cases where O is part of a final syllable ending in R. And what you need to know is that the R is just rolled lightly with just a flip. You get bord, port, and endort. And finally, all the remaining open O's are a default, basically prophète, cloche, and porte. Now the O will be modified in combination with an I or in combination with a U. So the O and I combination is simply a wa sound, as in voix. And the OU combination is simply oo, like an owl, hoo-hoo. So you get the word couvent. There is a final word in the oo category that you might find baffling. It's ouïr, which means to hear. Let's take it apart. The first sound is simply the oo sound that I already talked about, but it's followed by the I with the double dot, and that double dot is the French tréma. And the job of the tréma is to tell you that the I, in this case, belongs to its own syllable. So we have oo and I, and we can add the R to make it complete, and you have ouïr, ouïr. Our final vowel family is around the letter U, the letter U, pronounced U. This is the frontal rounded sound that we don't have in English that I talked about earlier with the sound. So the way to get your U is to start with an E sound, but make sure it's not an E with a smile like the word cheese, but it's forward with the tip of your tongue stuck to the bottom teeth. E. And then you simply round your lips with courage and conviction. Most of the time people just simply don't round the lips enough. So you really need to round the lips. You go from E, U. And there are about a dozen words with the U in this song, and I'll just highlight a few. And if you can get these, you can get all of them. So we're off to a roaring start with the first example, murmure. And it's just a big puckering party because you have those two U sounds. And the R gets in the way, and so you really have to flip the R on the tip of the tongue so everything stays forward. Murmure. Now the next one is also a mouthful, and the only way you'll manage it is by bringing all your consonants forward like murmure with your tongue right behind your teeth. Sépulcral, sépulcral. And the third one, just so that you know, it starts with a silent H. So it's hurle. And finally, if you're still confused, this one's for you. Confus, confus. French also has many words with U and I combined, and this song has many examples. The U is the same as I just explained, and is simply followed by I. And just to be fancy, this is the symbol for that combination, oui. There are 5 words in this song that have this combination, but they occur more than once. They're short but tricky, and they are well worth your time. We have fuit, puis, bruit, nuit, and suis. Now, many of the vowels in French have nasal equivalents. I'm not going to cover the nasal sounds in this video, but I have links in the description box with timestamps where I cover the nasal sounds in other videos. So if you need to work on those, you can check out those videos. Well, there you have it, Les Djinns by Gabrielle Fauré with poetry by Victor Hugo. Once again, I thought this would be a simple diction video, but as I looked at the poem a little bit closer, it did turn into a bit of a journey of discovery. So I hope you enjoyed that. A special thank you if you made it this far. Please like, share, subscribe, and comment below, and I will see you in the next video.